and welcome to Washington Exec's video series. I'm senior reporter Rachel Kirkland, and I am joined today by Stan Soloway, president of Celero Strategies, LLC. Stan is here to weigh in on recent efforts around diversity, equity, and inclusion within government. Welcome, Stan.
Rachel, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Stan, would you start out by just framing for us what we're seeing around the administration's recent request for information regarding DE&I solutions?
So let's start from even before that, which is that the president during the campaign and through the transition made it very clear that equity writ large was going to be a lens through which they would funnel everything. All policies would have an equity perspective to it. So it only goes to follow that the role of the government as a buyer is going to be an area that they want to look at. The RFI basically is a crowdsourcing tool that they're using to get all kinds of ideas as to how to better leverage federal spending to drive greater equity in various ways. And I think there's some complexity and nuance to it that is often missed, which we can come back to in a second. But that's what they're trying to do. It's I think the first time I've ever seen an administration use an RFI process to get policy ideas like this. Usually typically an RFI is around a specific procurement or specific need, but they've opened the aperture and said, come one, come all, give us your ideas.
Absolutely. And what challenges and potential blind spots do you think decision makers should keep in mind when they're setting DE&I goals and benchmarks?
Well, I think and I think this applies very directly to the RFI. The RFI has both the potential to open a really important and interesting and potentially very exciting discussion about how, if we step back and think more broadly about DE&I and the role of the government acquisition process in it. But the same token, there's always a risk of ignoring some nuance and not looking at it holistically. To specifically answer your question, to me, the number one issue is what data do we have to help us generate the right policy going forward? And this is an administration that has properly made evidence-based policymaking and data-based policymaking a top priority and a focus. And this seems to me to be an area where we really need to exercise that. We do not have good data on where the dollars flow today. We know a certain percentage goes to small business. We know a certain percentage goes to small disadvantaged businesses in prime contracts. We do not have very good visibility into subcontracting, which is another huge pot of money, which is all part of the big picture of how are we leveraging the process and the system to create a distribution of opportunity. Second to that, even when you look at areas we have basic data, for instance, I know that X percent of federal dollars are going to small women-owned businesses or minority-owned enterprises or whatever. I have no data that tells me in an aggregated usable form, where's the work being done? And even equally importantly, what kind of work is it? So how much, and so anyway, it's a data question. So what that brings us to, and I don't make this a long ramble here, but what this brings us to is recognizing when we talk about fairness and equity in federal procurement, it has multiple layers. There's the fairness of the process itself. I'm bidding, you're bidding, we should both be treated fairly. That's an underpinning of federal acquisition. There is fairness in distribution of opportunity. That is why we have preference programs, set-aside programs, and so forth to make sure there are opportunities to underserved communities. But then there's equity and fairness at a slightly different level, and that is the degree to which federal spending can actually help communities in need and also close the economic gaps that we know exist across the country, the racial and other economic and social gaps that exist. That's an area we don't typically focus on. That's the impact piece. That's the what kind of work are you subcontracting? If it's all lower end work that's not terribly upwardly mobile, am I meaningfully really affecting the economic gap? So there's a whole set of questions, and this RFI opens the door to having that really robust discussion, which I would hope to have, because I think it's a great discussion to have.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, you worked in this space over 30 years. What lessons do you think we can take from previous conversations?
Lessons in terms of this RFI?
Yeah.
I mean, so I would guess I would come back to what I said a minute ago. So we've seen way too many examples of really well-intended policy ideas either die on the vine because they didn't have the sustained leadership behind them to make them a reality. And we've seen way too many cases where really good ideas fell victim to the easy button. because the pressure to get something done overweighed the pressure or the push to make sure we did it right and took the time to really do the assessment and the analysis. I think it's fair to say that today, given the capabilities of technology, we can aggregate, assess, and analyze the kinds of data we need much more facilely than we could in the past. Without, I mean, the last thing in the world we want is a burdensome compliance regime added on to everything else that's out there already. In fact, if there's another lesson learned, it would be do not make this a bureaucratic compliance process, because it will not happen. But there are other ways to get at it. So I think those are three things that we've seen too often, that we are in a position we could, if we had the right leadership in place, they could actually avoid them.
Now, you've said before that the request for information is a great launching point for broad and comprehensive conversation around DE&I. Where do you see the conversation going from here?
I think it's a great question, and it's the hardest one to answer because we don't know. The administration has raised some really important questions. And if we take the RFI at face value and the administration's commitment in this area at face value, we could be on the cusp of a very large conversation that has some interim steps, but a much longer span of discussion, analysis, and policy development around these big questions, as DE&I is front and center now. You talk to any of the companies that are part of Washington Executive and talk to the CEOs. As an event of yours not too long ago, I talked to several CEOs, and they are seriously discussing what their responsibilities, opportunities, and roles are in this. Not that they haven't had programs focused on DEI in the past, but there's a whole new way of thinking about it, looking at it, assessing it, measuring it. All of that begins to translate over here. The other possibility, frankly, is that the RFI closes in July, and the administration does after that what it has already said it might do, which is raise some goals, some set-aside goals, wash your hands, and move on to another problem. That would be unfortunate, because I think there's so much more we could be talking about, but that's always a possibility as well.
Well, something to keep an eye on. I appreciate you coming on here and sharing your insights and your thoughts. Thank you so much.
Rachel, it's great to be here. Thanks so much.
Take care.